Today marks 21 days until the general strike against Congress. The American Union, let me stop share. The American Union is a different model for voting. And tonight we're going to talk a little bit about how that'll work. Let me introduce myself. My name is Brian, and I'm the founder of the American Union. Back in my 20s, I was involved in third-party politics, trying to change the system that way. During my 30s, I spent half a dozen years serving in the state legislature, trying to change the system from the inside. And now that I'm in my 40s, I realize we need a new strategy. And so I founded the Phoenix Congress and the American Union as a way to influence Congress and change the way that American government works. So on October 15th is a general strike against Congress, because as we look around at what's going on in our country, realize that Congress is the roadblock. Congress is supposed to be the legislative branch. They are the ones who are supposed to set policy for this country. And too frequently, they're passing the buck. Either they're not doing anything, they're waiting for the courts to step in and tell everyone what the policy should be, like they allowed to happen with abortion for 50 years, or they let the executive branch step in. They delegate their duties, like the endless wars, and say, decades ago said, all right, Mr. President, here's authority for you to conduct military operations, despite the fact that the Constitution is very clear. Congress is supposed to be in charge of declaring war. And so Congress is dropping the ball. They are the obstacle, and there's a number of reasons for it. But what do we do about it? As I said, I've tried working within third parties. Maybe we can run third-party candidates, and they will get up and they will charge into the swamp of Washington, and then they will reform the system and it'll all work again. Well, that doesn't work. Maybe we can reform it from the inside. We can nominate, some moderate people, or some people who will go in there and be our white knights and clean everything up. And that doesn't work either, because of the way that Congress is set up as an institution, where, when I was serving in the legislature, you had to pick a party. I picked Team Democrat. You had to pick a party in order to be an effective legislator. And it's just as true in Congress. So we need a new strategy. So how do we influence Congress? How do we kick them in the rear and make them legislate, make them set policy? And the answer is, in the 21st century, we the people can do it ourselves. We can crowdsource the legislative process. And so today we published the Blueprint for a Better America, a final offer for the American people, including the 535 members of Congress, one legislative package to end poverty, end mass incarceration, and end the endless wars. These are good policies that a lot of Americans support, and by offering it to Congress for a straight up or down vote, that's how we can force them to act. The problem is, reforms have to be realistic. Because Congress is in charge of deciding, how elections are run, how the seats are distributed, all these sorts of things. You're sort of a catch-22 if you say, well, we should amend the rules and then Congress will be more functional. But to amend the rules and laws, you got to make Congress functional first. And so you're trapped in this vicious cycle. And so unionizing as voters is a way to influence the system from outside without having to get elected first. And the way that this works is as a moral crusade to influence Congress, to inspire them to be better, to remind them of our constitutional duties. And by unionizing as voters, that's how we, the people, can get influence over Congress. Now, imagine that you were a big company or an industry or something like that, and you wanted to influence Congress and get some piece of legislation passed, right? That would make your business or industry more profitable, or stifle competition or something like that. Now, assuming you have the resources, it would probably be it is pretty straightforward to do, right? You can make campaign contributions to candidates for office. You can donate to people on both sides of the aisle so that no matter who wins, you've got influence on whoever gets into office. And there's no, you can donate to all the important people. You can spread money around and buy influence that way. That's the way that the system works. And for the vast majority of Americans, most of whom couldn't even make an unexpected $1,000 expense, we don't have the money to buy members of Congress. In 2020, the congressional races cost an average of $18.5 million each. Obviously, the Senate races were more expensive than some of the House races, but on average. And so there's no way that we, the people, can ever raise enough money to buy enough influence to make Congress look out for us. And so we can flip the model around and leverage the thing that we do have in abundance, the thing that we do have more of than any of these big industries, and that's our votes. And by unionizing, you don't even need a huge amount to be the deciders. Let me share my screen again here, and I'll show you a little more about what I'm talking about. Okay. The other thing that I skipped over is that starting these meetings off with the preamble to the Constitution. We're citing the preamble. So I would like to take a minute to do that and invite you to join me in reminding ourselves of what America is about. These are the words, the 52 words that start off our Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. That's what America is about. That's the mission statement for our country. All right, let's go on to looking at how unionizing as voters is different than being a third party or some of our other options. So imagine you've got 20 voters that are going to decide the outcome of an election. And most of them are going to break up into two different teams. So we got team one and team two, and they're pretty evenly matched. And this is sort of analogous to the Republican and Democratic Party as a whole nationwide. Now, the way that a lot of congressional districts work out, these groupings are lopsided, and we can predict with pretty good confidence who the winners are going to be in 400 of the 435 congressional races, simply based on party affiliation. So this is our scenario, but you've got some voters, some people left over that maybe a couple of them prefer third parties like Greens or Libertarians, or a couple of people who are just frustrated and don't even bother to vote because they have listened for years, for decades maybe, to candidates make nebulous campaign promises and then get elected and go to Congress and nothing really changes. And so why should they continue to invest their time and effort into trying to elect candidates if nothing is going to change? And so you can understand where that's coming from. Likewise with the third party candidates, these two groupings, the two-party system, is a practical matter because we elect single member districts. We elect representatives from single member districts. Duverger's law says that we're going to end up with a two-party system, that because you've got one winner, the most efficient thing is to only have one loser as well. If you had three parties or four parties, then you'd have all different parties, campaigns that were investing time, money, resources into running candidates only to get nothing in return. And this is why again, why we have had a stable two-party system basically for the entire history of the United States. There's a couple irregularities here and there, but it stabilizes back into a two-party system. You've got a party in power and a party trying to get into power. And Americans may say, well, we wish we had more parties, but what they're really saying is we wish that somebody would spend millions and millions of dollars on a losing campaign. And that's not a sustainable way to run a party. So the Greens and the Libertarians tend to be driven more by principle, but you can't field the resources necessary to compete with these national parties. So let's imagine this is our voting system, right? And we've got all these disgruntled voters who don't like either of the two major parties, but they do want to see the system change. And I think it's worth pointing out that a lot of people who vote with the Republicans and Democrats, some of them are very passionate supporters, but others are just practical, that they recognize that we have a two-party system. And so they have to pick a team in order to be effective. So the idea of so the strategy the Greens and Libertarians use is to be spoilers and say, look, we're going to withhold our votes. And eventually that's going to cause you guys to lose elections. And then eventually you will get frustrated and you will adopt some of our policies in order to win our votes. And that's a strategy that might work. But this is a strategy of trying to catch more flies with vinegar than with honey, and saying, look, if we just make things so miserable for the two parties, then eventually they will come around and start adopting some of our policies. It's possible, but as you know the saying, you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. And so unionizing as voters is a way of having these disgruntled voters come together as a union and say, look, we are going to support one of these two parties. We don't have any strong opinions about which one it is, but this is what we want. And for the American Union, this is what we want: the blueprint for a better America, end poverty, end mass incarceration, and end the endless wars. And so as a union of voters, this is enough to be the deciders. Now, the Republicans and Democrats really, really like to win. They invest millions and millions of dollars into these congressional races, and they want to get some return on it. And so when there's a block of voters out there that will be the deciders, that will flip it from one, will push the needle in one direction or the other, they have to take that seriously. Now, the important thing about unionizing as voters is that it's a commitment to put our votes together, to vote as a block, to be the deciders. Some people seem to think that a union of voters a general strike means withholding our votes. And so going back to this scenario where we have no influence. And that's not the point of a union of voters. A union of voters accepts the responsibility for being the deciders. So when we come together around one set of demands, we vote together in order to maximize our influence. Like I said, this 300, 400 seats in Congress are already predetermined. We know who's going to win in those races. But that is why the American Union is a national union of voters, because we can have one specific set of legislative demands in all 470 races for Congress across the country, with one easy to understand set of demands: end poverty, end mass incarceration, and end the endless wars. The other way to look at, when you stop thinking about the candidates in terms of party affiliation and just look at what exactly how do we influence the system, they really fall into two natural categories. You have the incumbents, could be Republicans or Democrats, and then you have the challengers, likewise, could be Republicans or Democrats. And so unionizing as voters gives us an opportunity to pit incumbents versus challengers. Again, you've got the party in power, the party seeking power, but doing this on an individual in an individual district by district basis. So here in North Carolina, we have a US Senate seat that's up for grabs. And I believe the Republican and Democrat are both polling around 43, 44%. And you've got another handful of people that are undecided and another handful of people that are going to vote for the Green or Libertarian Party candidates. But you can tell by where we're at with 44, 40, 43, 44, that you've got 12 or 13% of the voting population that is not happy with the choices that they have, but that they easily have the power to control the outcome, that just a small percentage can flip whether this US Senate seat goes from Republican to Democrat. And we've got a number of congressional races around the country that are like that. And so by having one national block of voters able to influence different races and seats around the country, that's the way that we can get national leverage over Congress, by being able to control the ultimate balance of power after the 2022 election. And so a union of voters will end up giving their support to one of the candidates from one of the two major parties in the election, enough to be the decider. Now, the important thing is that commitment to be the decider, the commitment to vote together for one of the major party candidates. Now, the question comes up, what happens if neither party wants to meet our terms? Well, the answer is that you still have to be the decider. So whether that boils down to trying to influence the national outcome of the balance of power through deciding that one race, or whether it's done randomly, endorsing and electing a candidate based on some random circumstances. The important part is that those votes are on the table, because that's what makes the major parties have to take it seriously. If the only threat is that we're going to walk away, it doesn't have any influence. And you can see this in countries that have tried this, where the opposition tries to boycott the election and say, we are going to disrupt your legitimacy by refusing to participate in the election. And it almost never works. Instead, the party that's in power gains even more power, and the party that stops competing for it loses relevancy. And so that's a strategy that just doesn't work. Instead, we can delegitimize the winners by electing them at random, or threatening to elect them at random. So if you've got a Democrat and a Republican, neither of which who is real enthusiastic about the idea of ending poverty, ending mass incarceration, ending the endless wars, because there's a lot of industries that make a lot of money on allowing these things to exist, and they tend to write campaign checks. So they're not enthusiastic about it. But the question is one of them is going to get those votes. And so the Democrat and the Republican both have to be afraid that the other one is going to win if they don't accept this offer. So by putting those votes on the table, you ensure that this set of demands has to be taken seriously. Now, when it comes to nonviolent movements delivering political change, studies have found that 3.5% is what it takes. And that is the case here in America too. If you look back at the statistics from the 2020 election, you'll find that a 3.5% block of voters could have flipped as many as 8 US Senate seats and as many as 59 House seats, more than enough to control the balance of power. When you have a Congress that is 50-50, the Senate is 50-50, and the House is, I believe, 215 to 211. These are very closely divided chambers. And so a small percentage of voters willing to be the deciders can have oversized influence. But for this to work, you've got to have this block of this union have something that they agree on, right? You've got to have a common set of demands. And so what are our common demands? What are our common goals? Well, if you remember, that is what the preamble is. The preamble is the mission statement for the United States. These are the things that America is supposed to be doing. We are supposed to establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. And the Blueprint for a Better America uses those 5 duties as the framework. And I will go into those in a little more depth in just a few minutes and explain exactly how we translate those duties into ending poverty, ending mass incarceration, and ending the endless wars. This is, before I do that, I guess I want to talk a little bit more about why this is important to do now, because America is at a time of great change. We've just come through a pandemic that has disrupted our country. And so we can't go back to being the way that we were before the pandemic. We can't look backwards. You've got to look forward. And so the question is, who do we want to be as a nation? What do we want to be? What do we want to accomplish? What do we want to achieve? And again, the Constitution, the preamble, is our mission statement. Let those be our guiding principles. But since we can't go back, if we don't steer in a good, positive direction, there's a chance that we end up going in a negative direction, that all the gridlock in Washington just makes so many people so frustrated that they snap and things get ugly. Now, this has happened before. America has a cycle of reinventing itself about every 80 years. And it started back in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, where the colonists were fed up with an unresponsive government, the parliament all the way across the Atlantic Ocean that was running managing their country, their colonies, and it wasn't cutting it. So they declared independence and tried to set up a country that would address these problems. And so that was what produced the Constitution. That was America 1.0, where nobody liked everything in the Constitution. Everybody had to make some compromises. But the fact is that it was so much better than the status quo that they were compromises worth making, that America set up these checks and these balances between Congress and the executive branch and the judicial branch. Now, as I said, over time, Congress, the legislative branch, has kind of been shirking its duties, and it's really hard for the other branches to force them to act. And we, the people, have kind of allowed them to get away with it. So unionizing as voters is a way to change that back. But after we set up America 1.0, about 80 years later, we had another problem, and that was the racial injustice of slavery. And the Dred Scott decision and the idea that the Supreme Court would say Black people have no rights that white people are bound to respect or recognize. And this was not a sustainable course of action. And so the Republican Party, through the violence of the Civil War, ended slavery. And again, things got to a boiling point where they erupted into violence. Just like the Revolutionary War, we had the Civil War that killed hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Americans. Unfortunately, about 80 years later, when we ran into another big problem of economic injustice through the Great Depression and in the 1930s, we solved that problem non-violently by electing President FDR and a Democratic supermajority. And over his time in office, they enacted the New Deal. And without having to resort to a civil war or any sort of fighting, they were able to address the problems of economic injustice and move the country forward. That was America 3.0, where government took a more active role in ensuring the general welfare of its citizens. Unfortunately, when we enacted America 3.0, we took a step back on racial injustice. The things like the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1937 very explicitly excluded farm workers and domestic helpers from the Fair Labor Standards Act, so you didn't have to pay them overtime. And while this was technically race neutral on its face, these were occupations that were predominantly held by people of color. And a couple of years later, they passed the Marijuana Tax Stamp Act and started laying the foundation for the war on drugs that has decimated communities of color today. And so 80 years later, we got the pandemic and we've got American society disrupted. We've got 58% of Americans who say that democracy needs major reforms, and yet we've got 80% of Americans who think Congress is doing a terrible job, and yet 90% of them are going to get reelected. That the people, because we are trapped in this two-party system, have no great way to get leverage over Congress. And the people who have leverage are the people who are able to buy the influence necessary to push things through in Congress. Some of the other most influential members of Congress, especially in the Senate, right? You've got Joe Manchin and Sinema, because they have, between the two of them, they have a block of 4% of the votes in the Senate. And, you know, as we identified that 3.5% number earlier, again, it takes a small block of voters that are willing to go one way or the other to have oversized influence. And so if that's what 4% of the Senate can generate that much power, 3.5–4% of voters in the United States can have a similar power over Congress. So that is how we can upgrade to America 4.0, is by unionizing as voters, by having a nonviolent revolution, a radical revolution of values, as Martin Luther King described it. And so before we get into the blueprint itself, I'll just share my screen here again. And so, yeah, so Martin Luther King, 1 year before he was assassinated, gave his speech Beyond Vietnam, and he challenged the American people. He said, "Our only hope today lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit, to go out into a sometimes hostile world, declaring eternal opposition to poverty, racism, and militarism. And with this powerful commitment, we shall boldly challenge the status quo." Now, this was more than 50 years ago, and these three interconnected evils of poverty, racism, and militarism are still with us today. They still need to be addressed. And we still need to challenge the status quo that allows those things to exist, that is okay with 37 million Americans living in poverty, including about 12 million children. The status quo that allows 2 million Americans to wake up behind bars every single day, while at the same time, we are now spending close to $1 trillion a year going to the military-industrial complex. It's time to change these things. And so the blueprint for a better America will do that. This is the legislative package, and I'm going to go through the table of contents today and talk a little bit about what are the issues that are in it. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the process of how exactly the general strike against Congress works. So the Blueprint for a Better America was introduced back in January, and a number of people worked on amending it and approving it, digging into the details over the course of the year. And so now we have a finished product that everyone in America will have weeks to look at and decide. This isn't like the Affordable Care Act where you have to pass it to find out what's in it. This is a crowdsourced legislative package. It's open source that everyone can see exactly what's in it and how it works. And so let's take a look. And so we have 5 titles in the legislative package, and they correspond to the 5 duties in the preamble, starting with establish justice. And there's a lot of justice that needs to be, injustices that need to be addressed in America. And you can see this first section is the George Floyd Justice Act. And it has been more than 2 years since he was murdered, and since tens of millions of people took to the streets to protest and call for change. And very little, very little has happened since then. And in fact, we are now going in the opposite direction, where there are proposals to increase police budgets, and rather than address the problems that led to the death of George Floyd and so many other people. So in Title I, we've got 3 main sections that work out to generally police reform, prosecutorial reform, and prison reforms. And I'm just going to go through the basic policies very quickly. Reform qualified immunity, require the police to be trained on their duty to intervene, restrict their use of chokeholds, and to require the police to be trained on de-escalation techniques, that deadly force is a last resort, end of the 1033 program that sends military equipment to law enforcement for our cities and goes to our city streets. We close the consent loophole for law enforcement engaging in sexual acts with people in their custody. We restrict no-knock warrants, reform cash bail, end the practice of civil asset forfeiture on the federal level, and on the state level, restrict it so much as to be practically useless. And the way that we encourage states, because this is a federal legislative package, the way that we encourage states is by leveraging the grants to the states that are made through the Burn Grant Program. There's also a national police misconduct registry and a national requirement that the police be trained and certified. Second subtitle is the Weldon-Angelos Justice Act, and this deals with ending the federal war on drugs. Michelle Alexander, in her book, The New Jim Crow, she concluded that if we become serious about ending the system of mass incarceration, we must end the war on drugs. There is no way around it. And so to end mass incarceration, the United States would end the federal drug war. And just the way that we would end drug prohibition the same way that we ended alcohol prohibition, which is fix it on the federal level and let states set their own policies. So we'll go into this more next week, but that's the basic policy of ending the federal drug war. In addition, we would reform the Espionage Act. It has been used to charge whistleblowers such as Julian Assange, Reality Winner, Edward Snowden, Daniel Hale, and others. And so this will clarify that whistleblowing was not espionage. We clarify the Real ID Act, repeal mandatory minimums, wipe them off from the United States Code. And then as far as prison reforms, would include second look legislation, allowing someone who's served more than 10 years to request a sentence review, repeal the Prison Litigation Reform Act, restore access to Pell Grants for incarcerated Americans, repeal incarceration incentive grants to the states, ensure that people leaving federal prison have identification, and to address the recent Supreme Court decision, Shin v. Ramirez, we would amend the section of the U.S. Code to ensure that people who had ineffective counsel were able to present new evidence of their innocence. And then last but not least is restricting the use of solitary confinement. Mass incarceration is a moral stain on America. And so we can do better by digging into the United States Code and cleaning up these things and trying to get back to our first duty of establishing justice. Our second duty, though, is to ensure domestic tranquility. And political parties especially are terrible about this. They try and stir up as much anger and frustration and dislike of the other as possible. So if we want to ensure domestic tranquility, we need a way to de-escalate things. And so one of the concerns that people have about a union of swing voters is, well, if you don't pay attention to party affiliation and we elect the Democrat or the Republican, aren't they going to take my guns or my abortions away? And so the blueprint de-escalates that conflict by restricting Congress from introducing or considering or enacting any gun or abortion bans for 10 years. And at the same time, gives something to each side, codifies the Hyde Amendment, and enacts universal background checks for gun sales. And that's Title II. Title III is providing for the common defense. And we have far, far exceeded our mandate. The framers were very opposed to the idea of standing armies. And we got a huge, as I said, we're spending nearly $1 trillion a year on the military industrial complex. So this will scale us back closer to what the framers intended, starting with Congress reclaiming its authority over our military adventures overseas. And so the 2001 authorization for military force, it's been called the blank check for the endless wars, that would sunset in 8 months, and the authorizations AUMF for Iraq would be repealed on passage of the blueprint. Would clarify that the president could not use military force against Iran without Congress's permission. Over the next 5 years, we would cut the military budget by 1/3, reduce the number of foreign military bases, and reduce our nuclear stockpile. Right now, we're getting ready to invest in upgrading our nuclear weapons and potentially starting a new arms race, despite the fact that nobody wins with a nuclear war. And so this legislation would halt those upgrades and instead put us on a path of reducing our stockpile by 50% over 5 years. The other part of this chapter is improving America's moral standing in the world. That includes restricting the use of economic sanctions against civilian populations, which cause lots of harm to innocent civilian populations. Suspending the arms transfers to Saudi Arabia for their war on Yemen, and likewise ending any support or military participation with Saudi Arabia's war on Yemen. We'll prohibit the purchase of landmines and the development of lethal autonomous weapons, and close Guantanamo Bay military prison. Title IV, our fourth duty, is to promote the general welfare. And welfare has a very specific meaning if you look it up. It means health, happiness, and prosperity. And the Constitution says that Congress is supposed to promote these things. It's not just in the preamble, but they reiterated it the framers did in Article 1, Section 8, that the Congress has a duty to provide for the general welfare. And so there's a number of issues that will be addressed by the blueprint. The first is public option for health insurance. This is what Joe Biden promised the American people when he ran for president. And so we demand that Congress put it on his desk for him to sign, a public option so that people could, so we can decouple employment and insurance. As well as a common sense reform of requiring negotiation for prescription drug prices. You may have seen recently that Congress did something similar to this, but what they really did was say that like 3 years from now, Congress could negotiate on, I forget, 5 or 10 prescription drugs. And so in the meantime, the United States will just continue to overpay billions and billions of dollars for prescription drugs that again, the big pharmaceutical companies have a lot of money sloshing around Washington, D.C. They are able to buy the influence that gets them these tens of millions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars in profits every year. And so the way that we, the people, can counteract that influence is not through money, but with our votes. Next part of this title is paid family leave. The blueprint will establish 18 weeks of paid family leave. And we'll talk more about that in a couple of weeks. We'll also reform our monetary system and have the US Treasury set up free digital bank accounts for every citizen, and then pay into them universal basic income of $1,300 a month or $300 a week. And the universal basic income program is our American Union Jobs program. It's not a job in any sense of employment, but it's a reminder that as Americans, we have duties, that we have things we're supposed to do, those 5 duties from the preamble. And so it's $300 a week to be a better American. And just as importantly, lift every American family up above the poverty line with $300 a week for adults plus $100 a week for kids. There are far too many people struggling in this country, and there is no reason that we must allow so many people to live in poverty. It is a policy choice that we can fix, that we can demand Congress correct by unionizing as voters. In addition, we'll also, as part of the ending poverty plank, we'll update the resource limit for people on supplemental security income. Congress set this at $1,500 back in 1972 and said they weren't allowed to have more than that much money in the bank. And now it is, 50 years later, and it's only been raised to $2,000. And so this would raise it up to, significantly. Now, how do we pay for universal basic income? And one of the offsets is a value-added tax. There's a 12% value-added tax that we'll talk about in a couple weeks. And there's also kind of a criminal justice reform part, as well as establishing justice, is a tax on lawyers that would go to fund a legal services voucher program for anyone who got arrested, so that they would have immediate access to be able to purchase legal services. And then Title V is secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. The way that we secure the blessings of liberty, the way is by voting. And, the framers were innovators back in the 18th century when they said, okay, white men can vote on who they want their representatives to be. And then America 2.0, we allowed Black men to vote as well. And by the time America 3.0 rolled around, we allowed women to vote too. But we still have millions and millions of people in this country who have been disenfranchised, who are not allowed to vote. And so in America 4.0, every citizen would be able to vote in federal elections, universal suffrage. And then securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Our posterity is our kids. And that means being stewards of the environment, making sure that they don't inherit a mess. So there are pollution fees that are offsets for the Universal Basic Income Program, including a carbon fee starting at $20 per metric ton, and a fee on plastic to discourage single use and encourage more recycling. And those are the policies that are in the blueprint for a better America. So I'll stop this for just a second. And so for the next 21 days through October 14th, we'll be holding these live streams each night at 7 p.m. And we're going to break down all of those policies into more details. So the American people can understand exactly what it means, exactly what's being proposed. This isn't pass the bill so you can find out what's in it. The information is there. This is a sincere offer to all the candidates for Congress and across those 470 federal races. And so everyone will have 3 weeks to decide. Do they want to end poverty, end mass incarceration, and end the endless wars? Do they want to accept Martin Luther King's challenge that to challenge the status quo? Or do we want to continue with business as usual? Do we want to continue to see things bounce back and forth between the party in power, the party trying to get power, and nothing really changes? The American Union is a way to change the system. It doesn't require changing any rules, adopting ranked choice voting, or anything like that. It just requires that Americans be willing to work together and agree on what do we want done? What do we want Congress to do? Now, addressing Martin Luther King's triple evils is a moral crusade to address poverty, racism, and militarism. And so this campaign is rooted in nonviolence, in the strategies and the teachings of Mohandas Gandhi, of Martin Luther King, of Cesar Chavez, of their methods of nonviolent organizing. And so the general strike on October 15th is a hartal. And this is a one-day general strike that Gandhi used as part of his nonviolent war of independence against the British 100 years ago. And so a hartal is 1 day of refusing to work, if possible, unless you're an essential worker, refusing to work, refusing to spend any money, and it's observed with a day of fasting to send a message that we are united, that we're in solidarity, that shared self-sacrifice is a way of building ourselves up and our country up. And it also is very relevant to the legislative package itself, because with those 50 different policies in there, nobody likes everything that's in there. But in order, just the same way that the framers, none of them liked everything that was in the Constitution, but they recognized that America was worth saving, and so they were willing to compromise in order to establish America 1.0. And so in 2022, to establish America 4.0, we're going to have to be willing to compromise as well. And so fasting and compromise are two sides of the same coin. They're willingly giving something up. And so on October 15th, you're invited to observe a 24-hour fast of just drinking water for a 24-hour period, of refusing to spend any money, and if possible, refusing employment, to put our thumb on the scales of the economy for 1 day and say, look, we the people demand change. We cannot allow the status quo to continue unchallenged. Now, as my own personal commitment to seeing this effort succeed, I today began a 21-day fast, and I ask anyone who wants to de-escalate the 2022 midterms to join me on the 21st day, on October 15th, with a 24-hour fast of their own. Now, this is not a hunger strike. This is a fast to capacity. 21 days is what I can safely do. And I'll keep you updated as we go along. My starting weight is 201 pounds, and I'm going to demonstrate that you can safely go 21. It's possible to go 21 days without eating. So the question then on October 15th becomes, if I'm capable of observing a 24-hour fast and I choose not to, if I know that America is capable of solving these problems of poverty, of mass incarceration, and of reining in our military, if we're capable of doing these things and we choose not to, if we choose to allow them to exist, what does that say about us? We have the capability to be better. We have a blueprint for building a better America. And I want to just go through section 2 through the findings and just read these briefly a little bit more about what Martin Luther King had to say about his triple evils. So section 2 of the Blueprint for a Better America is the findings and purpose. Findings. The Congress finds the following. Martin Luther King identified the triple evils of poverty, racism, and militarism, declaring before his death in 1968, Our only hope today lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit, to go out into a sometimes hostile world, declaring eternal opposition to poverty, racism, and militarism. With this powerful commitment, we shall boldly challenge the status quo. 2. The revolutionary spirit that Dr. King spoke of is embedded within the preamble of the Constitution, which outlines 5 duties for all Americans, individually and collectively. Those ideals are the driver for this legislative package. 3. Tens of millions of Americans live below the poverty line, including millions of children. Dr. King called for a basic income, stating, "We must develop a program that will drive the nation to a guaranteed annual income. We are likely to find that the problems of housing and education, instead of preceding the elimination of poverty, will themselves be affected if poverty is first abolished. The poor, transformed into purchasers, will do a great deal on their own. A host of positive psychological changes inevitably will result from widespread economic security. The dignity of the individual will flourish when the decisions concerning his life are in his own hands, when he has the means to seek self-improvement. Personal conflicts among husbands, wives, and children will diminish when the unjust measurement of human worth on the scale of dollars is eliminated. Now our country can do this." 4. America's system of mass incarceration has grown the prison population to 8 times what it was at the end of Dr. King's life. It has been called the new Jim Crow because of its disproportionate effect on communities of color. Despite similar usage rates among races, people of color are more likely to be arrested and incarcerated in the war on drugs. Dr. King wrote about racial bias in his letter from the Birmingham jail. "All segregation statutes are unjust because the segregator distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. It is not only politically, economically, and sociologically unsound, but it is morally wrong and sinful. An unjust law is a code that a majority inflicts on a minority that is not binding on itself. This is difference made legal." 5. Dr. King spoke vehemently against the endless war of Vietnam, and many of his observations are just as true of the Middle East. The only change came from America as we increased our troop commitments in support of governments which were singularly corrupt, inept, and without popular support. Now they languish under our bombs and consider us, not their fellow Vietnamese, the real enemy. They know they must move on or be destroyed by our bombs. So far, we may have killed 1 million of them, mostly children. We have destroyed their 2 most cherished institutions, the family and the village. We have destroyed their land, their crops. Now there is little left to build on, save bitterness. We must speak for them and raise the questions they cannot raise. These too are our brothers. The purpose of this act is to end poverty, end mass incarceration, and end the endless wars in order to build a better America. How does that sound? Do you want to see America solve these problems? Because we can. We have the capability. We have the power. And so you can join the American Union at our website, anamericanunion.com. Sign up for our newsletter and make a contribution to help spread this message. The American Union is set up as a super PAC, so none of this money goes, and none of the money that's raised goes to any candidates or any campaign committees. It only goes to grow the American Union, to spread this message that we the people can work together, that we the people can crowdsource functional government, that we the people can solve our problems, and that in the 21st century, we don't have to depend on electing Republicans or Democrats to try and represent us, that we are capable of representing ourselves. You know, we have crowdsourced millions and millions of pages of information on Wikipedia. We can crowdsource a few hundred pages of legislation that will transform America, that will end poverty, end mass incarceration, and end the endless wars. Over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to go through every page of this legislation. So if you want to know what's in it, if you have questions, ask your questions in the chat, or you can send us an email. Send me an email, brian@anamericanunion.com. And if you have a question, I guarantee you that lots of other people have the same question too. So please don't be afraid to ask. But Congress is dropping the ball. Congress is failing to act. And so the general strike against Congress says enough is enough. We refuse to let this go on. And we demand better. We demand immediate passage of the blueprint for a better America. The demand of the general strike is for Congress to enact it within 10 days. There's no technical hurdles that would prevent Congress from doing this. They are the legislative branch, the most powerful country in the world. They have the ability to pass legislation just like that. And so the easiest, simplest way for them to do that would be to take a bill that's in a committee of conference and replace that text with the blueprint for a better America. And then it would go to both the House and the Senate for a straight up or down vote. And before the election, before tens of millions of Americans cast their ballots, we can know where all the members of Congress stand. Do they want to keep poverty? Do they want to keep mass incarceration? Do they want to keep the endless wars? Some of them do, some of them don't, but let's get them on the record. And so join us on October 15th in demanding that Congress act within 10 days. You know, when Congress did this back in December of 2020, they passed a 5,593 page piece of legislation, and they gave members of Congress like 3 hours to look it over before they had to vote. You know, that is not the best way to manage government. Instead, we're putting this legislative package out there so everyone in America has 3 weeks to decide if they like what's in it, if these will solve the problems, or if there's some deal breaker. Like maybe you want to end poverty and end mass incarceration, but you don't want to end the endless wars. And so you've got to decide, do you agree with Meatloaf, who said 2 out of 3 ain't bad? Maybe there's some deal breaker in here, but with 50 different policies, there's an awful lot for everybody to like. And so by coming together, by being a union of voters who are fed up with the Republicans and Democrats and the choices that they are offering us, who are fed up and frustrated with the gridlock in Washington that has allowed so many problems to fester for so many years, for decades even, and know that we, the people, are capable of doing more, of doing better. We can come together and we can solve these problems. 3.5% of Americans is what it will take. And I guarantee you that 96.5% of Americans are not enthusiastic about the system of government we have now. So the solution isn't to replace Congress. The solution is to make it so unpopular, unpalatable, so unthinkable that they wouldn't pass the blueprint before the election, because being on the record of allowing these problems to exist in those last critical weeks before the election might hurt their chances as well. In upcoming episodes, I'll talk more about how the endorsement process works and how exactly this will go going forward. But this is a good introduction to what the American Union is, what the Blueprint for a Better America is, how you can be part of the solution, how you can help America solve these problems in 2022. So if you're a frustrated voter who doesn't want to vote because you don't trust politicians, that's okay. You don't have to trust them because it's already written down. This is not a nebulous thing when somebody says, oh, well, I'll reform healthcare. What does that mean? Well, it's written down exactly how a public option for health insurance would be instituted. And before we'd ask you to vote for, and before we vote, candidates and congressmen would either signal up or down on this legislation. So we can turn the model around. If you're a third-party voter that knows that being a spoiler, the Greens and Libertarians have been trying this for decades and decades of trying to spoil their way into significance. And I understand, I understand the frustration and the desire to not vote for the duopoly. Believe me, I voted third party for decades, but it's not changing anything. And we have a responsibility, not just to our kids, but to each other. We have a responsibility to do better. We have a responsibility to solve these problems if we're capable, and we are. So if you're a third party voter, come together around one set of demands that gets you a lot of things that you like. Greens and Libertarians, all the third parties, parties of principle, have lots of things that they like within these legislative packages because they are based on on Dr. King's principles of nonviolence, on recognizing the humanity in all of us and addressing his triple evils. So policy, putting policy over partisan politics is the way that we can move America forward. All right, I'm just going to check and see if we got any questions or anything in the chat. And if not, I think we are, I think this is probably a good place to stop. So the way this is going to work is for the next 3 nights, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, we're going to go over all the provisions in the George Floyd Justice Act and how exactly all of those would work, why they're necessary, how they establish justice, and again, and how they work. And then on Wednesday, do another a catch-up day, more general, explaining the philosophy, the tactics, the strategy, and taking questions on Wednesday. Then we'll do 3 more days of digging into the legislation. October 2nd, which is Gandhi's birthday, the International Day of Nonviolence. We'll spend the session talking more about the principles of nonviolence and again, taking questions about the legislation. And we'll just keep moving forward, 3 days of digging into the legislation, and then on the 4th day, taking questions and digging more in. And that'll carry us through October 14th. We'll close on Friday, October 14th with day of questions, and I will stay on for as many hours as it takes to answer people's questions. And then on October 15th, everyone can decide. Do you want to be part of the solution? Do you want to solve these problems? And if so, on October 15th, join the general strike against Congress. Don't work, don't fast, don't work, don't shop, don't eat, and take to the street. That's how we, the people, can take back the power. Until next time, we'll see you next time.